Something interesting about humans is how much we claim to know. The reality is that while we may know something, most of us don't know why we know it. Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and originally today I wanted to talk about the Thry class, the Romulan Thry class. Why? Because, it's long overdue that I talk about the Thry. I was sort of meaning to do it back when I did that revival of Wings of Romulus, but I ended up sort of folding it into various other videos talking about plasma weapons or the Nova class, and the end result was that I talked around the Thry, but I never actually talked about the Thry in itself. But I'm not going to be talking about the Thry today either, even though it's actually quite relevant to the current day. So, why am I not going to be talking about the Thry today? Well, because we run into a problem. How big is the Thry? You can't just trust STO, because STO gives you a 600 meter long Klingon battleship in the original series era. So we have to work it out for ourselves. Okay, we say it's bigger than the Romulan bird of prey, and we can probably use the Romulan bird of prey as a basis of scaling. Absolutely, sure thing. Here's a problem. How big is the Romulan bird of prey? I'm sure you're going to tell me right now, it's about 130 meters. Why? Why is it 130 meters? I know why you're saying it's 130 meters, because that's what everyone says. That's what everyone agrees on. So why am I saying that this is up for debate? Well, because when you actually delve into what a 130 meter long Romulan bird of prey actually means, it turns out that it gets a little bit more complicated and problematic, because at 130 meters long, a Romulan bird of prey, that's quite big. Volumetrically, in terms of actual overall volume, it is very, very similar to that of a Constitution class. Now, you're probably going to say, that's perfectly fine, but then stop and think about it for a minute, because the Romulan bird of prey is not meant to be like the Constitution class. We don't have the same visual evidence for its size, and most people seem to have just simply glanced right over what to me looks like the best source available. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about the size of the Romulan bird of prey. Why it is we have, this understanding, this accepted wisdom that is actually incorrect. The first thing we're going to talk about is the various sources. This entire list has actually been compiled by Jim Batitis in 2022. You can find this on the Cygnus website, so well done, Jim, thank you very much. Essentially, we have about 3 sizes, roughly. There are other sizes available, but the 3 we're most concerned with. So the first one is by Michael McMaster in 1977. He did basically an illustration cutaway of the Romulan, he called it a cruiser, and in that, he gives the size of the Romulan bird of prey as 68.2 meters long. Now, in subsequent size comparisons from various media, it was more positioned at around 100 to 122 meters. Again, it varies quite considerably between them, but that kind of size range. And then Fasa puts it at 136 meters. How have all these different people come to different results, different answers for the same ship? Bearing in mind, the Romulan bird of prey, we're all looking at the same model, right? It's not one of these instances where there are actually differences between the models, say the D7 and the Katinga, where there's subtle differences between those two models, which have different implications for their scaling. Ultimately, the reason it's so complicated with the Romulan bird of prey is because of its windows, or are they? See, this is the thing, because McMaster, on his diagrams, points out these little circles on the hull as sensors. The windows are actually square, and there's relatively few windows. And that actually would make sense, given what we know about this ship. It's a stealth ship. Or more precisely, it's a U-boat. You're not going to have much in the way of windows. And indeed, when we look at the ship's interior, it doesn't have any portholes or windows. Whereas you'd kind of expect to see them, given how common these little glowing dots are on the surface of the ship. But if you take those to be windows, you would get a size of 136. That is actually effectively double the original size at 136 meters. So what's my problem with 136 meters? Because if you interpret those circular dots as windows, which is not unreasonable, you would end up with a ship that is very close to the Constitution in volume. The reason that people probably came to this conclusion is because, well, it would work well for Fasa. You've got to bear in mind that that's where the 136 meter long length came from, was from Fasa. When they were designing Fasa, they're making a game system and they want the three icons of the show at that point, the Constitution, the D7, and the Romulan bird of prey, to be roughly equal. Obviously, they don't have to be 1-to-1, but they have to be relatively balanced to each other. They're assuming that players will want to use these ships. And so you're going to end up sort of calibrating it around them, and you're going to want to keep them all relatively within touching distance of one another in terms of capabilities. But if that was really the case, if it was really the case that we had this larger Romulan bird of prey, you would have thought that the balance of terror would be a very different affair. What we see in the balance of terror is essentially a small ship with a single weapon that is basically sent out to do a very simple mission. The thing is when you then have a 130 meter long bird of prey, you then run into the problem of, is that it? That's all you're putting on a ship that size? If you look at the deck plans or cutaways of a Romulan bird of prey when it's scaled at that size, it looks pretty sparse in terms of other armaments. Now, of course, most games then give it other armaments, but that is not backed up by what we see in the show. What we see in the show, what we see in Balance of Terror, is that this ship has only one weapon. So my point being is that if it was actually that size, Balance of Terror would be playing out very differently. Whereas the smaller size does make sense, particularly when you consider that the Romulan bird of prey is meant to be a U-boat. It's not meant to be a 1-to-1 with Federation heavy cruisers, it's meant to be a U-boat. U-boats are small and, in terms of their interior, quite compact. So again, when you look at a cutaway that has like 5 decks, that's a bit big to be a U-boat. That's like, I don't even know if modern submarines, your modern nuclear submarines, are 5 decks tall, but certainly U-boats were definitely not. If you look at the original McMaster's design, it's only 3 decks. It's also got other features like the ability to land on planetary surfaces, which is also quite useful because you would imagine that this ship has very limited range. In that sense, I think that for what the Romulan bird of prey is meant to be, and we know that it's meant to be this because they were very open about, they were making a U-boat story, they were doing a submarine story when they made the Balance of Terror. It makes sense to take the smaller McMaster 68 meter length. So now I suppose this comes back to a question of sources, because of course, as I said, most sources actually point to this 136 to 100 meters, so why disagree? I've got one source that says 68, and I've got a whole bunch of other sources that say bigger. So why am I going with the one source that disagrees? This is basically because, well, there's a bias towards looking at the most original source, because they're the least likely to be playing a game of telephone. In history, of course, it's very easy because you know who your primary sources are and you know who your secondary sources are. And you treat them very differently. Technically, you treat them very differently because you're not going to just take a primary source at its word. Equally, you need primary sources in order to inform the writings of the secondary source. You need them to actually go and collate those accounts to make sense of it, to even know that anything even happened. You have to have some level of trust in your sources. So that's a case of properly interpreting your sources for what they're meant to be. That's why I disregard the Fasa source in this particular instance, because Fasa, when they are making their game, they're making a game. Yes, they're, trying to be as close as possible, but it's a bit of a blank slate, and they want to keep all these ships relatively close together. And as I say, 136 is literally double the length. It is literally double the length, which makes me think that people at Fasa actually sat down and thought, it's a bit small at 68 meters. What if we double it? Oh yeah, now it looks roughly commensurate with the other ships, and it works for our game. So that's why I'm more biased towards McMaster as a source, because in 1977, there had been far, far less of a game of telephone / Chinese whispers, whereas, where we are today, when it comes to older starships, I am of the view that the best source to go to is the original sources, because even if they're not 100% correct, if there's some errors, but you will understand the mentality behind the design. So ultimately, my argument is that the Romulan bird of prey is not 130 meters, as we've all been thinking for decades now. It is actually 68 meters long, making it far, far smaller than any of the other cruisers of the time, the Constitution and the D7. And why is it that small? Because it isn't a cruiser. It's a U-boat. As I say, when you look at this diagram of a 68-meter Romulan bird of prey, it feels like a U-boat. It conforms perfectly to its designs, rather than when you scale that up and you have this, you can see all sorts of cutaways and deck plans for 130-meter Romulan birds of prey. They all feel far, far too big. It then becomes a massive ship with a weirdly cramped bridge that probably isn't even a bridge. I mean, I don't think that is actually the bridge, because submarines don't really have bridges, or at least U-boats don't have bridges. They have conning towers, and that's what I think we're actually looking at on the Romulan bird of prey. The only other thing to talk about is that there is, of course, consequences to saying that the Romulan bird of prey is only 68 meters long. For starters, that means that any derivations of the bird of prey, any refits, like the atoll bird of prey, is of course going to also be smaller by a similar amount. It also means, what do you do with a design like Starglider, which was originally meant to be the smallest ship in the Romulan fleet, but then looks very big next to a 68-meter bird of prey. Do we scale that down? It depends how you want to use Starglider, what place it actually has in the Romulan fleet. Is it to fill the role of an even smaller ship, or is it just off doing its own thing? I suspect the latter. I suspect this was the Starglider is a case of doing their own thing. Just to wrap things up, I think this is just a very good lesson in terms of questioning what sources you value and asking why you know something. Don't take it for granted, but actually look into why the number exists, particularly when it comes to starship scaling. I've been guilty of this. We are all guilty of this. The main thing to do is always to try and verify for yourself, or look back for the oldest source that you can find, because that is, of course, the one that is least likely to have played the game of telephone. It's also a good lesson in terms of thinking about ships in what they are meant to do. Because, yes, if we took the Romulan bird of prey in a vacuum, you would probably think it reasonable to go for the bigger size, but once you realise that it's meant to be a U-boat, again, that smaller size makes a whole lot more sense. And this is something that actually ends up tying back to my video I did where I said scale matters, size matters. If you're designing a ship first to fulfill a story, that will dictate how you tell the story. Again, balance of terror. If it really was on a 138-meter long Romulan bird of prey, it would look very different. It would look very different. Not only would the battle play out differently, the interior of that ship would look very different. It would just be a completely different thing. Whereas what we actually see lines up better with a 68-meter bird of prey. Equally, this does play into other issues that you can have. Consider this. Why is the bridge on Next Generation smaller than the bridge on Excelsior in Star Trek 3? I'm just going to leave that thought with you, but it's something to consider when you're writing stories or you're designing ships. That's why scale matters. This is a perfect encapsulation of why. So ultimately, I suppose the question now is just, what does this mean for the Thry? How big is the Thry? Well, we have to find out another time. Thank you all so much for watching. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you disagree with me? Do you actually think that the Romulan bird of prey should be 130 meters, or have I made a sufficiently convincing argument, which basically boils down to, I've got an illustration from 1977 and it's a flipping U-boat? Does that convince you, or do you have other sources to suggest? Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next video. Thank you to my members for supporting the channel. My glorious Navarchs, Tully DT and Sean Farrell. My ever-dutiful commanders, Philip Ty, Birdmonster, Jeff Hallam, Mark Philippe, Robert Kahn Strider, David Reeves, Rella, Gabe Logan, Adam Bowman, Nicholas Walsh, Martin McConville, JC Tech Wizard, Alcara Dreamer, Gloom Cookie, Der Monarch, and Tin Alt. And I salute my Centurions, Pendlebury, Marcus Hall, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Occultatum Questo, John Nicole, Athie's Collection, Tobias Klein, Bird of Play D3, Khan the Skektal Overlord, David Jackson, Andy Clark, Quentin King, Shipmaster, Valetra Petra Siren, Japhany Hughes, Ian Hands, Rogel Dom, Terran Emperor, Stephen Ross, and Tom Mosley. And I thank all my loyal sub-lieutenants, and I welcome Jimbro, Robert Johnson, and Nightshade. Thank you for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.